Thank you, Chris. Wow, I was just telling Chris it's been years since I've given a conference talk, and I'm so excited to be back. I'm so excited to be in Petaluma. My claim to fame with Petaluma is I lived here for 1 year in the early 2010s. It's a beautiful space, and thank you very much for putting this together. All right, I go by August. I have been involved in the Python ecosystem for about 7 years now. I got my start here locally in the Bay Area at Hackbright, which is a coding boot camp. And about 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which came as a great relief for me at the time. And just about a year ago, was also diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum, which was another relief because I finally had words to explain this very unique collection of characteristics that I seem to have. And what prompted me to want to share this talk with you here is that in the last couple of work environments I've been in since getting my diagnosis, I started to realize that those work environments did not work for me at all, and I surmised that they had probably been set up by people who are what we call neurotypical, or people who don't have ADHD or autism or one of the many other types of neurodiversity. And so I really started struggling. I struggled to check my email. I struggled to stay on top of tasks. And I had to start devising my own systems for keeping track of everything that I needed to do. It was just really stressful for me, and I started learning that actually there was a lot of my colleagues who had ADHD in its various forms or who were on the autism spectrum. And so I just started to get really curious, is it the case that there are more neurodivergent people in software engineering? Do we have any data to support that theory? Because it was something that I was seeing myself. And so the talk I'm going to give today is obviously influenced very heavily by my own experience, but I've pulled in surveys from as official sources as I can find, and I'll mention what those are as we go along. So first, I thought it would be useful to just define the two types of neurodiversity that we're going to be talking about today. So the first one, ADHD, it is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And this is basically an ongoing pattern of inattention, not being able to focus, or in some people, hyperactivity, not being able to sit still or really requiring a lot of stimulus to get through the day. So there's basically three types of ADHD, the hyperactive type, the inattentive type, and then a combined type for folks who have sort of both of those characteristics. I myself fall under the inattentive type, so a lot of the examples I'll give today come from that realm. A few quick examples from each of those. If someone has hyperactive ADHD, like I said, they may have trouble sitting still, or they may need to use those fidget spinners, or just engage their bodies in some way to maintain a level of focus and calm. And someone with the inattentive type may have a hard time focusing, or they may have a hard time getting started on certain tasks, especially if those tasks require a complex number of things to happen in order to reach an outcome. And then, of course, the combination of those two types. And what's really interesting is that many of us have actually been exposed to stereotypes about people with ADHD. And I think in America, the most common one is young boys who are hyperactive and disruptive in class. I have seen this come up again and again in conversations, and in fact, there's such a wide array of people who are affected by ADHD, not just young children and not just boys, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the children with hyperactive ADHD tend to be the most visible because in the school setting, kind of all eyes are on them. But many people are not diagnosed with ADHD as kids. Many people don't discover, like I did, until adulthood that they actually have ADHD. And in a lot of those cases, they're finding out that they have the inattentive type, which is more maskable. It's easier for us to blend in because all of our symptoms are happening cognitively inside and aren't necessarily coming to the surface. The last thing I want to say is this word deficit. So deficit is actually a misnomer. People with ADHD tend to actually have so much capacity for attention and focus. It's just that every little thing captures our attention. So it's actually not a lack of attention, it's too much attention. Let's move on to autism. Whoops, there we go. So autism, I myself still struggle a little bit to talk about it because it's such a broad collection of symptoms, and there's such a range of severity is the word that a mental health professional would use. Usually people are diagnosed with autism very early in life. You can, even at 18 months or 24 months in a child, you can see certain characteristics or behaviors, like children who aren't developing speech, in traditional milestones, or children who have difficulty making eye contact or difficulty with emotional connection with adults or their peers. So those are just some examples. I was never diagnosed until just about a year ago, and that was thanks to a really wonderful therapist. So yeah, a broad range of conditions, and we've probably seen stereotypes about this as well, popularized in movies, and some of the more visible symptoms of autism would be things like folks who have a really hard time in social situations, or who have behaviors called stimming, which is where they are trying to provide stimulation to their bodies through perhaps hand flapping or repetitive body movements. And I do want to also point out we have some outdated labels at this point for people with autism. It used to be common to describe people with autism as high functioning or low functioning. We don't use those labels anymore, but we do recognize that autism happens along a spectrum. And it also used to be the case that if someone had high functioning autism, we would typically say that they had Asperger's syndrome. We also don't really, Asperger's is no longer considered its own diagnosis. It's just part of this constellation of symptoms for autism. And I also want to point out that these two types of neurodivergence often, but not always, occur together. I'm an example of this. I have both of these. Sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it really sucks. And so there's some overlap in the symptoms. People with ADHD and autism, they can both hyperfixate on things. We develop what our community calls special interests. So if any of you want to learn anything at all about woodworking or weaving or Raspberry Pi, I could probably talk to you for hours and hours about those things. A lot of us also need a very specific environment or very specific conditions in which we can do our best work, and that's because we're easily distractible, and many of us have figured out over time how to minimize those distractions. We're going to talk a little bit later about how all of this fits into a work setting, specifically on an engineering team. Other commonalities are social anxiety. I know for me, I'm constantly wondering, am I fitting in this group? Do people sense that I am different? And that kind of goes along with something called RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria. This is people who are very sensitive to even perceived slights or social rejections. Let's see. Along with this, I also want to point out that you may not know that one of your colleagues has ADHD or autism. Some people, their symptoms are perhaps less severe, or some people have developed strategies for masking behaviors or characteristics. I personally have done a lot of work related to social anxiety, so I'm happy to say that I'm enjoying myself much more today than I probably would have 10 years ago. So we talked a lot about symptoms. I want to talk about something that you may have seen come up recently in social media or in online spaces, which is a lot of people are talking now about ADHD superpowers. And I think it's maybe a clever word that is meant to kind of reclaim our power over this diagnosis. And a lot of people with ADHD, when we talk about superpowers, we're really trying to focus on our strengths. So there are some strengths that come along with an ADHD diagnosis. We love focus time. If you give us a project and you say, take the entire rest of the day to work on it, oh, it makes us so happy, because we do not do well with context switching or distractions. We're also incredibly creative. We're very kaleidoscopic thinkers. We love brainstorming. We love contributing ideas. So if you need to figure out how to take a product in a new direction, you might want to include us in that meeting room. We're also very big picture, long-term thinkers. We like to investigate and try to understand big systems that interact with each other. And I'll point out here, I keep saying the word we. I am speaking in a general term. I do want to be very specific that these characteristics and behaviors, they're very diverse, just as we're all different. I'm saying the word we kind of out of convenience, but I'm certainly not claiming that every single person who has ADHD has all of these characteristics. Many folks are deeply empathetic. We can be very emotionally open. And we're also really good at observing. And we also tend to have a high awareness. And we'll also see things that are happening around us that many other people might miss. Some people with ADHD, because they are able to maintain attention across multiple things, some people really excel juggling multiple tasks at the same time. Some people don't. I don't. I like to be given one specific task with a clear outcome and finish that thing before I move on to the next thing. So there are also superpowers on the autism spectrum. We have these special interests, which can also be called hyperfixations. So we can become experts in really obscure things. Like I said, I have a special interest in weaving and woodworking. And one thing I've learned over time, especially with my parents, before I launch into a conversation about one of those topics, I've learned to ask them, is it okay if I talk to you about XYZ for 10 minutes? People with autism also tend to be great at managing small details. This is not one of my superpowers. I am not good with managing a lot of small details. And people with autism also tend to have really great long-term memory. We can memorize things and learn things very quickly. It helps tremendously if we're actually interested in the thing. But as a quick example, if you were to show me a class photo from my first grade or any grade in elementary school, I could tell you the first and last name of every single kid that I went to class with. We're also really great at identifying patterns. One of my, fixations when I'm driving, whatever state I'm in, I like to look at the license plates, and I like to see how many letter groupings there are, and then I like to notice if the letters form an acronym whose elongated phrase I know. It's just really fun. Okay, so we've done a lot of backdrop, okay? We've talked about what is ADHD, what is autism, what are the symptoms, what are the superpowers. I want to start tying this into software engineering, which is why we're all here today. So by happenstance, as I was trying to find data for this hunch that I had that people who write code may be over-indexed for neurodivergence, I came across the StackOverflow developer surveys. The one for 2023 was released fairly recently, and interestingly, they did not ask about neurodivergence for this year, so that was a bit of a bummer, but we do have data for prior years, and so I want to quickly go through some of these. So the most recent survey for which we have data from StackOverflow respondents about ADHD and autism specifically is 2022. So last year, 15% of people who completed that survey self-reported that they either had ADHD or autism or both. 15%. So on a team of 20 engineers, which is maybe a fairly typical size team at a smaller company, that means on average 3 people of your colleagues have one or both of these specific types of neurodivergence. And when I saw that 15%, I was like, holy cow, that's actually really significant. The 2021 survey, so the year before that, it was 12%. And in 2020, it was 7.7%. And in 2019, it was 9%. So they consistently asked this question across those 4 years. And if you look at it, Yeah, if you take a step back, you can see that from 2020 to 2022, we see this really consistent rise. 7.7, 12%, 15%. And I suspected that might have been for a couple reasons. One, that was deep in the pandemic, maybe an increase of people becoming aware that these were conditions that might describe them, maybe an increase in people, perhaps through social media, were able to self-diagnose. There's also been a huge uptick in adult women who are coming to understand that they have an attentive type ADHD, and this makes a lot of sense for reasons that perhaps are beyond the scope of this talk. But it's fascinating that in our programming community, the level kind of just keeps rising. So when we look at the number of people the number of adults in the world who have ADHD, the WHO estimates that, the National Institute of Health estimates that the overall global prevalence is about 6.8%. For people with ADHD symptoms in adulthood who didn't have symptoms in childhood. It's 2.6% when we look at adults who were diagnosed in childhood and are now, older. So what's significant about this is it means that of the people who responded to that StackOverflow survey in 2022, they are twice as likely as the average global citizen to have ADHD. That really blew my mind. To me, that was just really significant. And we have to also consider, is the group of people who responded to that survey representative of the software engineering community as a whole? I don't actually know, but it's probably fairly close. And we also have similar data for global autism rates, and this comes from the World Health Organization. So 1% is the estimated global rate of autism in children, and there is no cure for autism. So presumably that 1% is probably even going to be a little bit higher by the time people get to adulthood, because people who weren't diagnosed with autism in childhood can still be diagnosed later as adults. So there were 4 times as many StackOverflow respondents in 2022 who said they had autism than the global average. That was, to me, just so interesting. So based on the StackOverflow survey and this data that I pulled from these 2 organizations, we can definitely see that there's a higher rate of neurodivergence among people who write code. And I use that phrase intentionally, people who write code, because not everyone who took the StackOverflow survey is a professional software engineer day in, day out. We've got people in academia, hobbyists, students. So I began to wonder, what is it about ADHD and autism that maybe make writing code an attractive hobby or vocation? Or if we flip that around, what is it about software engineering that attracts people with these types of neurodivergence? So the first thing is that programming is full of rules. And I can tell you, as someone with ADHD and autism, rules make me feel very safe. There's not a lot of gray areas. Rules help me reduce my cognitive load. I really like yes or no, on or off, true or false. Programming is full of all of that. Writing code requires focus. I talked about our ability to hyper-focus on things for long stretches of time as long as we aren't disturbed. We can stay in flow and in focus. We also love building things. The ADHD side of me is very creative and kaleidoscopic. I love to take a spec and have to build something that matches it. It also requires problem solving. Our brains tend to be able to process information very quickly, and we can think on our feet. So problem solving is fun for us. Writing code also means more time in front of a computer and less time with other people. Like I said before, social interactions can be really hard for us. So if we can minimize the need to do that, it's kind of a bonus. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually work all of this into our engineering teams. I have some suggestions for you. So the first would be to create a work environment that fosters ease for people with neurodivergent brains. If you could allow us to create work environments that suit our needs, even if it looks strange to you, it would probably go a long way in helping us be more productive. We might need to permanently work from home. We might need to have close proximity to a bathroom, to snacks, to space to stretch and move our bodies, or we may need to do things to refocus that would disturb other people in an office setting. If you could give us as much time as you possibly can for focus, like focus blocks. For me, it's like a minimum of 3 hours. Anything less than 3 hours, I feel rushed. I also have a bone to pick with the creators of Slack, because Slack is really difficult for me in particular, but a lot of people I talk to, because it constantly requires you to shift your attention, and it really destroys an ability to focus. If you could help us reduce our cognitive load as much as reasonable, obviously we still need to manage our own cognitive loads, but what I mean by that is help us define the scope of a project at the beginning, make the steps clear, tell us what the outcome is supposed to be, and send us on our way. We'll do really great work in that type of environment. If we can lead projects or lead some part of the code base that we're naturally very interested in, we will hyperfixate on that thing and become an expert in it, and that will help the team. We love hackathon time. We have so many ideas. We even have ideas of how we can improve things on the team or for the company. So if there's an internal hackathon that we get to do and we get to build one of those ideas, that gives us a lot of energy. If we can become experts on something, we love that. And coming back to this social thing, it's usually easier for us to avoid social situations. We're avoiding the anxiety that comes along with it. But we still want to be invited. Even though we're probably going to say no and not come, it means the world to us to be invited because we want to feel included and we want to feel seen. That is all I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments, or if you want to add or contribute to these slides as they continue to evolve, you can email me. I don't have Twitter, so email is the best way to get a hold of me, and I really thank you for your attention and for being here. So thanks.
Thanks, August. That was great.